I'm watching The Flying Padre by Stanley Kubrick. It's a short film, and I'm reacting because I am a minister, and I've been asked to comment on how this video portrays ministers in film. I understand this video is a documentary, so I imagine it's going to be a fairly true-to-life portrayal of at least a particular type of minister or a particular minister. This film is from 1951, and it's a short film by only about 9 minutes long by Stanley Kubrick. So let's see what it looks like.
To many of the people here, this plane, the Spirit of St. Joseph, has a special significance. It's the plane that brings their priest, the Reverend Fred Stockmiller. This is the story of 2 days, he'd call them 2 ordinary days in his life.
So this is interesting in that while my ministry isn't like this, there are many ministers who do have a ministry that's actually not all that different from what is being described here. Particularly those who minister in rural areas that don't have full-time access to a minister. So this Reverend Stockmiller, it looks like Stockmiller, he's a priest, and he is flying into these communities where they don't have a full-time priest. So he probably serves multiple communities that are spread out pretty considerably. And that's not really all that unusual. This probably still happens in parts of rural New Mexico. I wouldn't be surprised. It happens in island communities, in the Great Lakes and in the Atlantic, I know. It happens in Canada. There are certainly places in Canada. It happens in Native American communities. A lot of times they'll have kind of dispersed communities. That's probably what this is, actually. That'll be served by a minister who is fluent in the languages of those particular communities. So yeah, it's not something that is really a part of my ministry, this kind of circuit rider, but it's not unheard of, certainly.
Although his 11 mission churches are spread out over a 4,000 square mile area.
11 churches over 4,000 square miles. That's a long commute. That's a lot of churches. And these would be probably pretty tiny churches, like just small congregations. Probably a fairly sparsely populated area in rural New Mexico. I don't know how many people that would be. Maybe they'll tell us later, but that's a big area. So it makes sense that he would be flying a plane rather than trying to drive or ride a horse or something.
To the main parish in Mosquero, Father Stockmiller returns in his plane in the late afternoon to conduct evening devotions. Most of his parishioners.
So he's done a funeral in the morning, and he's going back for, it looks like, adoration of the sacrament in the evening or late afternoon at his main parish church. It looks like a pretty small church to me, which, again, not surprising. He's a missionary priest, and he's serving a really, really large area. This is probably a little less typical. This isn't unheard of, where you have sort of a pattern of regular devotional practice in the church. This is less typical of Protestant churches generally. Like I minister in a Protestant church, although we do have a tradition of daily prayer, and some churches do have daily services in our Lutheran tradition. It's not that common in the North American context. You'll find it every once in a while, but it's pretty unusual. Catholic churches, on the other hand, they do tend to have regular devotional services in addition to what we might consider the main services on Sunday. So they'll either be praying the Liturgy of the Hours or adoration of the Blessed Sacrament or something like that. And this will structure the day of the parish clergy as well as other members of their community. Um, Not being in that community myself, I don't know how typical that is, but I know that daily masses are pretty much the rule among Catholic clergy and in Catholic parishes now. Certainly less so in the Protestant world, but again, it's not unheard of. All right, I should point out that what's being shown here is this is the adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, and the priest is sort of covering his hands to pick up the monstrance in which the reserved sacrament is retained. Generally speaking, that's not part of Protestant practice. You may find it among some particularly Catholic-leaning Episcopalians, perhaps, although even in those communities it's probably pretty unusual. Outside of that, you're not going to find that really in Protestantism at all, at least in the Anglophone world. But it's an important devotional practice in the Catholic Church and the Western Rite. So, not really a part of my ministry, but certainly not unheard of even today.
The wise and friendly counsel of the priest is always available to his flock, and he listens attentively as the girl tells her story.
Now this is interesting because I would say that what's being described here, where he's sitting at home and eating breakfast, and a member of his parish comes and knocks on the door and has something wants to talk to him about. This is a really traditional model for pastoral care, which is probably not universal these days. I think that probably we have experienced since sometime in the mid-20th century a kind of professionalization of the clergy, where this kind of sort of living and working in the same space is less common than it once was. You still find this model, particularly in rural parishes. This is true among Protestants as well as Catholics, where they'll live in a parsonage that's right next door to the church, and your work, such as it is, that your desk work doesn't take place in your office, it takes place in your house, in the parsonage. When we lived in Australia, and I ministered in Australia, that was actually much more in line with the kind of experience that I had. We lived in a parsonage, and parishioners would just show up at the house, and we would talk with them. And my work was largely done at the house I lived in, and when I wasn't out visiting or conducting services or something like that. I did have an office at the church, but I didn't spend all that much time there. So that's a model that's still found in a big part of the world. But among Protestants in the U.S., that's less and less common, particularly in suburban settings. Like where I minister now, like we own our own house. It's at a distance from the church. People will still come over, but I don't have people just knocking on our door like we did when we lived in Australia, or this priest does, or would have probably been really typical of even my father-in-law. That was something that happened in his parish ministry. Not really a big part of mine, although people will call me on the phone, so I suppose there is that. So it's different, and I think now, we kind of treat it as this, there's a home space and a church space, and they're two distinct things. That wasn't always the case. And I don't know, for Catholics, it's probably different. Catholic priests are usually not married. Very, very seldom. There are a few situations in which Latin Rite Catholic priests can be married, but it's unusual. And you may find this more among Roman Catholics because they do tend to live in a rectory right near the church, and their life is more revolves around the calendar of the church. But it's probably less and less common among Protestants.
Playmate Pedro is a bully. He teases her, fights with her, is cruel to her. Won't Father talk to him? Padre says that he will at once, and his questioning soon discloses that the girl is right, that Pedro's conduct in the matter leaves something to be desired.
This is a particular kind of pastoral problem that I don't recall ever having to resolve disputes like along these lines. I think that is in some communities and was for a long time a really central role of pastors, whether Protestant or Catholic, and it's not unheard of today, but and certainly would be willing to step in if somebody asked me to in a role like that. But I that's not the sort of thing that I can recall ever having been asked to do. But again, I mean, I don't necessarily remember every kind of incident that has occurred in my ministry. It may be that I've been asked to resolve something like this and I just don't remember it.
When his work and studies permit, Father Stockmiller turns to his chief hobby, his birds. He raises canaries, occasionally sells them to members of his parish. He's also a crack shot, likes to hunt deer and other game.
So, I mean, this is pretty typical. A lot of ministers, we're encouraged to develop hobbies. The thing about the ministry is that I mean, it can be hard work. It's not that it's not generally laborious in the way that some people work hard, like lifting heavy things or things like that. But it can be a kind of work that just consumes your entire life. And so we are encouraged to have hobbies. And this particular priest looks like he raises canaries and does target shooting. I don't do either of those things, but I have other hobbies, and so yeah, I mean, nothing about this seems really unusual. I would say this is pretty typical. I mean, I don't know about raising canaries. It's kind of an unusual hobby for anyone these days, but you know, sometimes priests actually, especially Catholic priests, a lot of times they have really unique hobbies. I've noticed. I think maybe with the Catholic priests, it's because they're all bachelors and they can have hobbies that are a little bit different from what those of us with children could have. So
much of his spare time is spent keeping his plane in constant readiness. He borrowed $2,000 from a friend to buy it, and it served him and his neighbors well.
All right, so you can't see it, but he's working on his plane and he's wearing his clerical shirt. I probably would not wear my clerical collar while working on my plane. I wouldn't say that I'd never do it, but if it gets dirty, then I have to go change it. And he's like oiling it up and stuff, so I would probably change into some work clothes and then go change back into my clerical collar. But then I don't have an airplane either, so.
35 minutes after the phone call, the mother sees the Spirit of St. Joseph bank over her house. Ten minutes later, Father Stockmiller prepares to take off with his precious cargo. His destination is Tucumcari, where an ambulance is waiting at the airport to rush the child to a hospital.
Okay, so this is the sort of thing that pastors are sometimes called on to do. Like in an emergency situation such as this, he's taking the baby and his mother to the hospital. I have driven people to hospitals and things before in emergency and non-emergency settings. That's something that I have been called on to do. It's not necessarily something it's not a daily occurrence for me. It's not something that happens with a whole lot of regularity, but a lot of times, the pastor is somebody who can be called if you can't think of anyone else to call. And especially in rural settings like the one that's being described here, where they really are isolated, the minister can be kind of an all-purpose general help giver. And that's really important for the ministry. Our role is not simply it's not an exclusively pastoral one. Always, we have a responsibility to show care for our neighbor, and that's what's being described here. So, I've never flown a plane to a hospital because I don't know how, but certainly calls like this are things that we do occasionally expect in the ministry. The end. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fairly, it's obviously fictionalized somewhat, but it's a fairly realistic portrayal of what the life of a sort of missionary priest in a rural area like that would be. And maybe even still today. Certainly I know there are clergy who fly planes. That's not something I do, or a lot of them are allied with people who do. So they'll radio them up or call them up, and they'll, if there's a need for a plane, they'll get one. Yeah, that's not unusual. It's not really descriptive of the day-to-day ministry in every ministry setting, though. In urban and suburban, and even rural areas like the one that I'm in, it's not really like that. We're not nearly as isolated. But a lot of it does ring true. So it's a pretty good movie. Different from other Stanley Kubrick films that I've seen. Yeah, it's good. I would give it, I love old single reel films, so I'm going to give it an A.